Ancient kingdoms, lost civilizations, sunken cities, megalithic structures, and old stories of once great empires, warriors, god kings, and magic, tales of love, corruption, and war. I hope everybody's ready to get wet, because we're about to dive into a topic that excites the imagination and tests our ability to discern between true world history, reality, and science fiction. Many of us understand that the mythos and folklore of any ancient culture tend to tell the same old stories with different characters, different monsters, different gods. So let us explore the ancient lost empire of Atlantis to see if we can find anything that holds some weight. Did this place actually exist at one time? There are many questions about Atlantis, I am sure. But to find the answers, you have to go deep. So deep that sometimes what you find is nothing but darkness. There are scientists, scholars, investigators, researchers that spend a lot of time and resources into finding the lost city of Atlantis. When you want to solve a puzzle, you take all the information you can gather from anyone that has the information, and you can put the pieces of the puzzle together to solve it given enough time. The problem with this is when you are not sure that what you are looking for even exists. If you were led to a site to investigate some underwater ruins in the Atlantic, even if you found the remains of what could have been an entire city, how would you be able to identify that city as Atlantis? Are you going to look for a signpost that says, "Welcome to Atlantis"? No, you're going to look for preserved artifacts, carvings, art. You're going to study the architecture. You're going to look for any scrap of human remains. You have to look for something specific that will identify the city as Atlantis, according to accounts. Let's start with Plato's. The Greek philosopher, student of Socrates, and teacher of Aristotle, left us with the works Timaeus and Critias, our first source for information on Atlantis. In fact, the majority of the information we have on Atlantis comes from his works. So it was a small group of men, Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, Hermocrates, and Plato, telling stories, and Critias tells us the story of Atlantis, that he heard from his grandfather, who heard it from his uncle Japetus, who heard it from Solon, a lawgiver and Greek poet, who heard it from an elder priest during his 10-year exile in Egypt. Keep in mind, you have travel between Greece and Egypt and a mixture of cultures, which is why they have very similar stories, legends, mythology. Probably the only real difference between these two ancient cultures is race and language. Now, Plato gives us quite a few details about Atlantis, including its location. So why would it be located in the Antarctic? Why would it be located in Santorini or the Canary Islands? Why would it be located in the Bahama Islands or Malta or Doggerland beneath the North Sea? Why would it be in the Sahara Desert in a place known as the Eye of the Desert? Some people suspect Transylvania, Romania as a possible location for Atlantis. Isn't it interesting that Hotel Transylvania 3 has an Atlantis scene? And what's even more interesting is when you try to look up any information on Transylvania and Atlantis, this movie is what you get. pages and pages of it. To find the connection between Atlantis and Transylvania, take a look at the history of the Scythians, or the Dragon Lords, or Ring Lords, an antediluvian race of barbarians I like to call the Sith. People have hypothesized that Atlantis is located at all these different places around the Atlantic, but it seems people are trying to find Atlantis everywhere except where Plato said it was. You know, when someone writes something down, I would assume that Plato was very clear about what he wanted to relay to the reader. But of course, since Plato did not make up the story of Atlantis, it is only logical that one would look at other ancient tales of a similar nature and try to find connections. Besides, there are many people that believe Plato was deliberately trying to throw people off with his accounts. But some suggest that the place Plato was referring to was actually in Africa, in a time long ago, back when Africa was known as Lower and Upper Ethiopia, and the southern Atlantic was the Ethiopic Ocean. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in these days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits which you call the Columns of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, known as the Pillars of Hercules. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together. Now, this old Egyptian priest known to Solon was a genealogist and very knowledgeable about human history, telling Solon about a war between the ancient Athenians and the Atlanteans that apparently was lost by the Atlanteans due to the superior military of the Greeks. He told him how the Greeks were like children and lost a huge chunk of their history due to a reoccurring cataclysmic event. A deluge believed to be the result of a judgment upon Atlantis by the gods that sunk the empire in only one day. The priest emphasized how the Egyptians were able to hold on to the traditions and history of their ancestors. And basically what we see in ancient Egypt was the surviving culture of the old world prior to the deluge. So I may spoil the reading here a bit, but in Plato's Critias, he tells us the story of how Poseidon, the god of the sea, water, earthquakes, and horses, was given a division of land and island, and there he had children. In the center of the island was a very fertile plain. In the center of the plain was a low mountain, and in that mountain dwelled a man Ebenor, his wife Leucippe, and his daughter Cleito, of whom Poseidon became enamored. Now, to secure his love, Poseidon closed off the mountain with rings or zones varying in size, 2 at land, 3 at sea. Now, in those days, there was no shipping, so no one could get in. In the interior island, underground, he conveyed 2 springs of hot and cold, and was able to supply man with everything he needed to live. Those who were already on the island, of course. Here he begat a family of 5 pairs of twin male children, and the oldest of them, his name was Atlas, who was made king of the center island. His brother Eumelus was assigned part of the country that was nearest the straits, of Gibraltar that is. The other brothers were made chiefs over the rest of the island, and their kingdom extended as far as Egypt. I'll say that again. Their kingdom extended as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia, which is a part of Italy. Now keep in mind, this is all still before the deluge. Now Atlas was able to prosper due to precious metals that were mined, such as orichalcum, which is a type of copper alloy. There was an abundance of wood and herds of elephants. In Atlantis, mind you. There were many pastures for animals, herbs, grasses, fruit-bearing trees, temples, palaces, harbors, and docks. One of the first things the Atlanteans did was they bridged over the gaps of sea to make a path to the royal palace on the center island. At the same time, they also dug canals from the center island through the zones of land out to sea. Plato says the zones of earth were surrounded by walls of stone with diverse colors, black, white, and red. They quarried and hollowed out the land underneath the edges of the zones, creating double docks, with roofs of rock. The outermost walls were coated with brass, the second with tin, and the third, which was the wall of the citadel, fleshed with the reddish orichalcum. Now in the center of the citadel was a temple dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon, surrounded by an enclosure of gold. Poseidon's temple was covered in silver. The pinnacles were covered in gold, and the roof was ivory, decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The rest of the interior was lined with orichalcum. Outside the temple were golden statues of the descendants of the 10 kings and their wives. There were other palaces and altars, baths for men and separate baths for women. And there were both hot and cold water fountains, and water was supplied through aqueducts through the bridges to the outer circles. And the zones had temples, and in the larger of the two, there was a racetrack for horses that ran all around the island. The guards were placed in the zones according to who was most trusted. The most trusted of the guards were stationed closer to the citadel. The land between the harbor and the sea was divided by a wall, where there were many dwellings, and crowded, and apparently so crowded you could hear the hum of human voices. The plain surrounding the city was highly cultivated and sheltered by the mountains of the north. It was oblong, and falling out the straight line followed the circular ditch, which received water from the mountains out into the sea. The entire country was divided into 60,000 lots, each which was a square of 10 stadia, which is around 6,000 square feet if my math is correct. Each of the 10 kings were absolute in their own sector, only bound to the injunctions of Poseidon. By now you should have a pretty fair image of this place in your head. He gives terrain descriptions, coordinates, location names, the topography. It's not a riddle. If you go to the location that best fits the description and nothing is there, even if this extrusion in the Atlantic was once Atlantis, then I'm guessing that sucker is buried deep, away from where the city actually stood. Plato tells us that 9,000 years have elapsed since the time of which he is speaking, and the land which once was basically buried in the mudslide of the mountains during the deluge, a punishment of Zeus and the other gods on Poseidon's kingdom of sinners. Now Plato does give us a disclaimer, changing names for copyright reasons, I guess, since Solon was using the story in his poems. I don't know, but he does hint at his story being somewhat altered, but still claims it to be true. Even Plato is telling us stories about extraterrestrials coming down to Earth, having intercourse with human females, and producing giants that ruled the world. I mean, Atlas was a titan after all. I guess Plato left that part out. Now, nobody has found this place, folks. There are people who think they may have a good idea of where Atlantis, or whatever it was called, may have been. But again, the original story comes out of Egypt. And if it is a true story or legendary tale, it would have to be known by someone other than Solon and the Egyptian priests. We would need to find a similar story in Egypt and go from there to find its origins, which may come from somewhere else in Africa. And we've all heard different versions of the same story before, folks, with those common elements: men, women, and gods. The gods and human women. The titans and their strange-ass creatures. So that Atlantis is gone, okay? But what about the Aquaman version of Atlantis? The underwater kingdom? Where does that idea come from? Well, friends, for that, we're going to have to take a look at the sea, in which lives the next topic I am going to dive into, presenting a question of not where or how such a place could exist, but what type of beings could exist there.
What do you think when you see YouTube videos like this? Is there any merit to it?
Well, I think it's why I believe we can't immediately dismiss everything posted on the internet.
Is this the creature that you and your team found in South Africa?
From what I can see here, yes. The body recovered was incomplete, but based on the remains that were taken from us, it looks like the same species.